Inheriting the knowledge of metallurgy and smithing from their predecessors, the Celts used this mastery to spread across Europe and even go head-to-head with the Mediterranean civilizations. Their weapons, especially their swords, were as much a product of craft, as well as art. Celtic equipment and tactics would inspire their Roman counterparts, and their design of iron tools remains familiar even in modern examples. So where did it all start? And how did it end? Compared to the early Iron Age warriors in the heart of Europe, the Celtic warriors of La Ten culture introduced new and improved battle techniques and weapons. In general, the main change from the earlier time is that the Celtic military equipment allowed for more dynamic and mobile warfare. This is best seen in chariots, in elongated swords that were more practical on horseback than on foot, and in more flexible armor than that of the Hallstatt culture, which was marked by heavy bronze cuirasses and greaves. It is worth noting that researching Celtic military equipment and capabilities is difficult to uniformly explain, as it varied across time and space. What we can say is that their evolution of tactics and equipment was neither homogeneous, consistent, or even present across the entire Celtic world. Local craftsmanship was further influenced by specific local needs for armament, their cultural customs, and other aspects. Information about Celtic warfare is often based on partial records of classical authors of Mediterranean civilizations, like those of ancient Rome and Greece. Besides these biased and imprecise historical records, Celtic equipment was in large part made of organic materials, leaving us with precious little archaeological finds to form a full picture of their history and warfare. From what we do know, we can safely say that of the equipment that made a Celtic warrior, nothing caused so much pride as their swords. They represented the wielder's power, honor, and ultimate glory in battle. These beautiful and deadly pieces are probably the most famous and recognizable remains of Celtic culture. Compared to a shorter, broad, leaf-shaped blade with a mid-rib that was characteristic for the Hallstatt culture of the early Iron Age, a La Ten sword has a straight, narrower profile. They were double-edged weapons consisting of the blade and the hilt. The latter included an organic grip, usually made of bone, wood, or horn. The hilt was attached to the tang, ending in a knob or an otherwise shaped tip. The early La Ten swords were usually up to 80 centimeters long and had a noticeable rib running across the middle. With time, the swords would reach and even cross the 1 meter mark and drop the center rib. The decorated swords demonstrate a large degree of individualism, with every decoration being different and no two swords completely the same in terms of art and design. Different swords had different functions. Some were designed in such a way to be impractical as a hoard weapon, but probably functioned as a dueling weapon. In the 3rd century, daggers of more and more anthropomorphic characteristics began appearing. These possessed a hilt stylistically shaped into a human form, first vaguely but later with more and more attention to detail. While their composition is the same as that of combat weapons, their hilts and their depictions in the hands of prominent figures suggest being a status symbol or a display object. Another possible explanation is having a religious purpose, perhaps carried in ceremonies or even used for sacrificial purposes. Swords were at first short with a sharper point, a weapon of an infantryman. The change of fighting technique, including increased emphasis on horsemanship, required swords to become longer and more effective at slashing instead of stabbing. But in the 1st century, the pointed tip re-emerged, probably as a consequence of increasing clashes with the Roman legions, their tactics, and their equipment. In Iberia, the Romans faced Celts who wielded a different kind of sword, the falcata. This was a large, inward-curving, single-edged sword. It is believed that it was developed from the ancient Greek kopis, with which they seem to share many similarities, at least at first glance. The falcata could deliver a very powerful strike, something similar to an axe, but with slashing prowess of a conventional sword. Roman writers describe how falcata could split both shield and helmet. In response to this, the Romans redesigned their shields and armor for better protection. It is even indicated that the development of gladius, Roman short sword, was a direct reaction to the experience gained of facing falcata on the battlefield. The ancient manufacture of falcata was also quite fascinating, as described by Diodorus of Sicily. The Celts allegedly buried plates of iron in the ground and left them there for around 3 years, during which time they partially corroded. They would discard any weak metal and reforge the remainder through the Celtic method of pattern welding, the practice of forming a blade from several metal pieces of different composition. The blades were forge welded together and formed in a way to create a pattern which made the blade noticeably sturdier. Celts were masters of metallurgy and iron production. The craftsmen were capable of accurately decorating metal objects like swords, with typical enchased work. In the last centuries BC, Celts employed different types of wrought steel and iron and even made first attempts in surface carburizing, quenching, and forge welding. Some Roman authors note how Celtic swords would often bend and would have to be straightened mid-combat. But archaeological finds reveal high-quality blades that maintained their stiffness without being too heavy. Celtic smiths achieved this through additional folding of metal, blending, and rehammering using pattern welding techniques. Celtic swords were held in scabbards composed of two metallic plates and ending in a chap, which was bound and reinforced the plating. Scabbards and blades were often decorated with patterns of geometry, plants, and creatures. The earliest were decorated most often only at the top part, while later scabbards could be decorated at its tip too, or even throughout its full length. The decoration in the sword scabbards reflects the spiritual perceptions and the new outlook on life and death, nature, deities, the Celtic fantasy world with mythical beasts, dragons, birds, intertwining tendrils, and vegetal patterns. Belts to which the scabbards were tied to were at first made from two-piece iron chains, and later from leather straps, or different combinations of both elements. In improving metallurgy and other techniques, Celtic blacksmiths developed new tools like scythes, iron saws, hammers of varying types, tongs, scissors, chisels, and augers. These tools were perfected by the Celts to the point they retained their basic design all the way to the modern era. Compared to early Iron Age cultures, which utilized spears and axes as melee weapons of choice, early Celts preferred their double-bladed long swords. Despite that, a variety of spears has been found which, besides the regional differences, also reveals different purposes and specializations, like warfare and hunting. The earliest examples of Celtic spears could be divided according to design and purpose. The melee, leaf-shaped spear that usually carries a mid-rib, while ranged spearheads would be flat or even slightly hollowed, to bend easier. This would prevent an opponent from throwing the spear back. Specialized javelins, separate from other multifunctional spears, were rare in the earlier period, especially when compared to the Roman army. The Celts that settled in the Apennine Peninsula also saw the use of the pilum, an ancient javelin of Etruscan origin that would also be adopted by the Romans and Celts alike. In all armies, the pilum would undergo regular changes and improvements throughout centuries. As the number of Celtic warriors grew, so had their arms and production. Spears, being cheaper than swords, now exceeded their number. Just like with swords, spears too were gradually lengthened throughout the era, with spearheads alone reaching up to around 1 meter in length. The average total length of a spear was around 2.5 meters, which is similar to the dory spear used by Greek hoplites. The spearheads could be decorated with Celtic patterns of flora and fauna, and were attached to a wooden pole made of ash or other kind of tree. Celtic spearheads came in different shapes and sizes, most often leaf-shaped, but sometimes with a wavy shape or holes through it. Diodorus of Sicily writes how Celtic wavy spearheads would not merely make a penetrating wound, but also deform and tear the flesh upon both entering and removal. Just as Romans adapted to the weapons and tactics of the Celts, many Celtic tribes also learned from their opponents. As such, they made their spears narrower, in order to effectively pierce through Roman armor plating. Such development was more common in the Western Europe, while around the Danube River the spearheads generally maintained broader and shorter shape. Celts also implemented metallic butt spike to the other end of a spear, which was used for additional balance and could even act as a weapon if the shaft broke. This feature would be less and less used, as it became more and more rare for such an occurrence to happen. To compensate for the lack of balance this brought, the Celts would be changing the width of a shaft instead. Spears continued to be optimized for the changing tactics and warriors' preferences. Despite all these changes and adaptations, no specific model or design completely disappeared throughout the era. At range, they could use bow and arrows, slings, and throwing clubs. Besides barbed arrows, trilobate arrows of Scythian origins continue to make an appearance, like in the preceding Hallstatt societies. Archaeological finds show that Celts used bows and arrows, even though such finds are rare, and ancient authors would leave them out of their descriptions. The most obvious ranged weapon they mention, and even that sparsely, is a sling. Many sling stones have been found across Europe, credited to the La Tène culture. Shields also became more prominent among Celtic warriors. They were usually oval-shaped and made out of wood. Their centers consisted of barrel-shaped bosses of either wood or metal, with fan-like flanges. These centerpieces were meant to strengthen the shield and protect the arm. At first, these were made in two parts, but were later replaced with a single-piece boss. The shape also changed through time, from trapezoid and rectangular-shaped to circular and butterfly-shaped. The outer rim of the shield could also be protected with metal edge binding. A shield's dimensions varied throughout to best fit a warrior's skills, needs and preference. In the British Isles, elongated shields made of bronze and carrying large ornaments were excavated. These had little practical use, and were probably meant more for showing off, posturing, and increasing your own morale while depleting your opponents. Battle equipment of Celtic warriors also included a dagger, scissors, and a razor for grooming. As for their body armor, the lack of archaeological finds suggests the early versions seemed to be made of perishable materials like leather, linen, felt and hemp. What we have are depictions and statues that indicate that their armor resembled the classical style of so-called yoke and tube, consisting of cylindrical body, shoulder flaps, and a fabric skirt-like form. To this was also added a cape that protected a warrior's rear and neck. The continuous evolution of a warrior's equipment led to Celts adopting chainmail armor, which consisted of thousands of interlocking metal rings that better protected against slashes and cuts. Such pieces usually weighed between 10 and 20 kilograms, depending on the number and thickness of rings. A warrior had to wear additional layers of felt or leather below the mail, cushioning the weight, preventing rubbing, and providing additional protection against thrusting and blunt weapons. Due to the high cost of production and material, such armor was limited to the most prominent warriors and nobles. The commoners most often formed light infantry, lightly armored, agile fighters, often bowmen, who were used as skirmishers, screening force and support for cavalry. Just like in the preceding Hallstatt era, Celtic helmets went through an interesting change. But unlike in the Hallstatt culture, especially early Celtic helmets seem to have far less of a key role. The earliest examples are separated in two models, a simple, but functional skullcap type, and the conical type, which was less practical, but served better as a status symbol. It seems that among early Celts helmets were rare, and they more often fought bareheaded. Helmets could also be highly decorated, sometimes to the point of impracticality, but this was offset by intimidation and impressiveness. Unlike the early Celtic helmets that more resembled hats or caps, later models also protected their necks, cheeks and forehead. Romans would use such design as the main inspiration for their own models. Helmets were a mark of most important warriors. They were made from either iron or bronze, sometimes additionally decorated with enamel or coral. With time, a helmet became a fundamental element in a warrior's attire. From the 3rd century BC onwards, helmets with additional ornaments, like wings and horns, began to rise to prominence. Outside of weapons, the most prolific part of Celtic arsenal was probably their two-wheeled chariots. They were perceived back then similarly as are today armored vehicles. It was an Iron Age tank, most likely inspired by the Etruscans models. A typical chariot had a single axis and was pulled by two horses, which were usually smaller, but agile. The chariot was light, made in a combination of wood, leather, and metal. It could carry two people, the driver and the warrior, though a team of 3 has also been recorded. The drivers were free people of a poorer class, had to be very skilled and showcase a good synergy with their warrior companion. The charioteers faced cavalry of the opposing armies, threw their javelins from the distance and then joined the battle on foot. Chariots then withdrew, though they could return to transfer warriors to another part of the battlefield. This tactic strongly resembles the old Homeric battles of the Iliad, and similarly implies an overlap of warrior and noble classes. Chariots were also used as parade vehicles during funerals. These were different from war chariots, though they could potentially be converted, probably if the buried warrior utilized such vehicle. Horses themselves had a very important role in history. They were a status symbol that enabled and accelerated travel and transport. They also represented an important element of the Celtic spiritual world, along with boars and small ruminants. Celts could also have cavalry of their own. Unsurprising considering their well-established familiarity with horses and their mercenary service for the Mediterranean civilizations that already used such units. Horses, like chariots, were generally reserved for nobility and higher-ranking warriors, though even they often stepped down to fight on foot. The early Celtic cavalry relied on missile weapons and used their superior mobility to disengage and re-engage to hammer their foe. The rising prominence of cavalry can also be seen in the parallel increased length of swords. With some exceptions, Greeks and Romans rarely used their cavalry as a charging force. The Celts, though, put a heavy emphasis on it. In some cases, cavalry could account for 1/3 of the entire force. Hannibal also used Celtic cavalry, with good results. Their lack of organization, however, often meant that cavalry and infantry couldn't be properly coordinated. This was true even when Celtic cavalry reached its peak, in the last 2 centuries BC. This mastery was possible through improved tactics, horsemanship, technological development, and breeding horses specifically for warfare. The success of the cavalry brought the decline of war chariots in mainland Europe. Celtic cavalry was particularly highly valued in the Roman army, be it as mercenaries, vassals, or allies. Celts were often put in their auxiliary armies, which was especially true for the Romanized Celtic population at the frontiers of the Roman state. In some instances, friendly Celtic tribes also sent help to the Roman war expeditions. As for tactics, Celts heavily relied on the physical, as well as psychological impact of their massed charge. Celtic battle techniques gave them an advantage over the peoples they conquered across Europe, and they were in turn meticulously studied by their future enemies, the Romans. They were defeated by the Celts at the Battle of Allia, around 390 BC, which led to the sacking of Rome. This difficult experience for Rome became a valuable lesson and a pillar of negative perception of Celts. Romans saw Celtic warriors as fearless and bloodthirsty, looking down on their savage and barbarous culture while respecting their military prowess. Greek historian Polybius describes the tribes of Insubri and Boii going to battle against Rome, dressed in light coats and trousers, while the Geisati warriors faced their enemy naked, wearing nothing but their weapons. Unlike Greek phalanx and Roman legions, early Celtic armies were not well organized in battle formations and units. Celts were individualistic warriors, which is best demonstrated with their unique long swords. The closest to that was grouping according to their allegiance to a clan or a tribe, which was usually represented with a symbol or an insignia either carried or painted on a warrior's equipment. Adult men of all social classes could be warriors in Celtic society. Caesar describes how important was the induction into warriorhood for Gallic youths coming of age. This was the moment young men were given their first weapons and could publicly socialize with their fathers. He says, among the other usages of their life, they differ in this from almost all other nations, that they do not permit their children to approach them openly until they are grown up so as to be able to bear the service of war, and they regard it as indecorous for a son of boyish age to stand in public in the presence of his father. But while all men could wield weapons and be combat ready, only a select few had the honor of being a dedicated warrior or a knight. Warriors also wore torques, which are believed to have a religious significance. They are often found at deposition sites and Celtic deities are often depicted with them. Even when fighting naked, the Celtic warriors kept their torques and armlets. They obviously had a large importance, be it personal or religious. Celtic society and economy, especially at early times, didn't allow for massive, long-term levies. This meant the early warfare revolved around smaller skirmishes, instead of full-on warfare. But such circumstances did provide the population with the desire and capability for early adventure and mercenary work. Warbands and expeditions would be the driving force of early Celtic raiding lifestyle and later conquest and expansion. These warbands were often led by highborn warriors, perhaps younger sons of a tribal chieftain, who went out in search of their own adventure or territory. They could also resolve conflict or entire battles through single combat. When such an event occurred, the chieftains came forward, challenging the bravest warrior of the opposing force to a single combat. When accepted, the chieftain's attendants would recite their achievements, valor, and ancestors and attempt to belittle his opponent. Such duels were in line with the supposed Celtic bravado, and were the showcase of skill and a battle of honor. The duels had another effect: they could limit the amount of the dead by limiting hostilities to the selected heroes. Another war habit of the Celts were their battle chants that included shouts, shield thumping, and even dances. Their trumpets, or rather animal-headed horns, carnyx, could cause fear and lower morale of the enemy, as could druids with their incantations. As Celtic population grew, as well as their desire for adventure, conquest, and loot, many warbands and communities left their homeland in search of new grounds to settle, followed or joined by caravans of civilians and settlers. These migrating parties could mingle and cooperate together, forming tribal federations that would stick even after successful expeditions. Where they have encountered local populations, the interaction spread from establishing trade, melding together, or subjugation. Individuals and smaller groups of mercenaries, artisans, traders, and explorers influenced even societies that were harder to reach or lived on unsuitable terrain. In this way, Latin culture spread even to areas where Celts didn't settle on a large scale, leaving the local population to remain ethnically largely unchanged, while adopting the new Celtic culture. Celtic mercenary service with the Mediterranean civilizations, as well as conquest of new areas, brought modification and improvement to their tactics and equipment. Such were the imitations of phalanx, longer spears, larger shields, and hammer and anvil tactic. With the rising threat of Rome and Germanic tribes, and in order to protect their new chiefdoms, Celtic armies had to expand from narrow aristocracy and knights of noble descent to include craftsmen, merchants, stock breeders, and lesser landowners. Vastly oversimplifying, the Celtic warriors went from nobles to mercenaries and adventurers, and now to also include commoners. From warbands, now proper armies were taking shape, organized under the tribal apparatus and its leadership. In the last centuries BC, the expanding economy, caused by the introduction of Celtic coinage and expanding trade, allowed easier maintenance of standing armies. Still, this organization would never reach that of, for example, the Roman or Greek armies. The Celts were the antimony of the Roman army when it came to discipline and organization. They threw everything in the first attack, driven by religion, glory, battle hysteria, accompanying sounds, and alcohol. Their fury lacked control though, and once emptied out, the Celts were quick to disperse and driven away by a more disciplined and organized army. Failure was unacceptable to the Celtic chieftains, with many descriptions of warriors making a suicidal charge into an opposing army, or even making actual suicide after a failed battle. Mingling of different social classes within a growing Celtic army, and their contact with neighboring armies, brought mass adoption of Mediterranean equipment, strategy, and assigning of different roles. This can be seen in an increasing degree of tactical units with specialized skills and military equipment. The increasing number of warriors also meant standardization in the equipment production process. Again, it is worth noting that with Celtic peoples now spread across the continent, such developments vary across different tribes and regions, as they maintained local elements and were influenced to varying levels by neighboring peoples, cultures, and civilizations. Strabo, an ancient Greek historian, acknowledges their qualities and gives them a certain benefit of the doubt, despite his subjective and judging manner towards the Celts, whom Romans saw as barbarians. He writes, "The whole race, which is now called both Gallic and Galatic, is war-mad, and both high-spirited and quick for battle, although otherwise simple and not ill-mannered. And therefore, if roused, they come together all at once for the struggle, both openly and without circumspection, so that for those who wish to defeat them by stratagem, they become easy to deal with. In fact, irritate them when, where, or by what chance pretext you please, and you have them ready to risk their lives with nothing to help them in the struggle, but might and daring. Whereas, if coaxed, they so easily devote themselves to useful activities, not only of training in general, but of language studies as well. As for their might, it arises partly from their large physique and partly from their numbers." Stuck between a rock and a hard place, that is between the disciplined Roman army and invading Germanic tribes, the Celtic warriors eventually declined along with their general population. The Roman state took over their heartland, with Celtic population enduring more or less only on the northwestern fringes of Europe. Despite the early successes, the Celts would be eventually overpowered by the superior tactics, equipment, and organization of Rome. That's not to say that their collapse was immediate or easy. The campaigns of Julius Caesar remain some of the most famous events of the entire history, both because of the scale of the achievement, as well as preserved documentation. The Celts lacked unity, and while some continued to resist, many communities and tribes formed friendly relations with Rome, taking over their customs and culture both before and after conquest. While some elements of culture and identity remained within Celtic population, the poetically fearless warriors of old were now gone.